So now is the time where you actually have to commit to an object and glue all of these parts together. So you've been working on these multiple pieces, um, and for a lot of people, this is the safe place to be. This is the fun part. It's kind of like prep work. You've devised a system for yourself. You're following that system, and you can kind of work on autopilot a little bit. So sometimes people wait way too long to start assembling the object because this is where they are comfortable and this is the sort of like fun place to be working. But I strongly suggest that you actually start assembling your object as soon as possible. At least don't wait for the night before it's due because you're going to need um, probably to do multiple sittings so that you can use the proper glues and allow parts to dry before you build it up. You also might not anticipate all of the things that will happen when you're building it. Maybe, something works one way on paper or in your head and works very differently in space. Um, so you need to give yourself time for that. You also might need to edit things out and manufacture other elements. You've probably noticed that all of my demo pieces actually are not present if you've been watching the other videos. And that is because there were way too many different personalities, and the first object I made was really too busy. It was way too over designed, and it was all the parts were conflicting with one another. So I narrowed it down to these essential sort of three different elements, and we'll build an object that way. Um, so I do design before I start, but I also leave some room for play when I'm actually putting things together. And a lot of artists, refer to that as play or refer to that as dialogue with their work. But all that is really just being present while you're making. So maybe things that you anticipated working together don't in actual space, like I just mentioned, or maybe you need to, build other parts, or maybe, you have to deviate from the original design. You're sort of like putting pieces together and figuring out like maybe the orientation of some of the parts work better actually in person than when you originally thought. So you want to have that present dialogue with your work as you're making. It is okay to deviate from your original plan if it suits the final result. Um, so leave that space for that dialogue with the work, and you need again extra time in order to do that so you're not rushing to finish it. So the thing I hear from students most often when they're disappointed with their work is, if I had more time I would have done this, this, and this. And a lot of times that is because they waited way too long for that last step. Maybe the piece would be smaller than they wanted, but it would be much better crafted, or maybe they didn't even need all the parts that they made. So you don't want to rush that last step because that's the step that gets to the final object. You can make the most beautiful elements, but if the whole effect is compromised by rushing your craftsmanship or rushing your assemblage or using materials that aren't quite the best materials in order to get it together quickly, that is that's the result that people see. So the actual elements that you've been laboring over don't actually um, they don't have the impact that you intended because the final object um, is not considered enough. So give yourself plenty of time to to work on that final object, to commit to the form and start, gluing things together. Um, and so you can start to make changes to make sure it stands correctly or that it reads right, from all sides. Notice when I'm working, I'm actually moving my sculpture around constantly so that I'm working from multiple perspectives and designing the whole object rather than, one fixed viewpoint, another fixed viewpoint. And then I'm making choices about, do I want everything to be visible all from one side, or do I want things to be concealed and revealed as as you move around the sculpture? So, um, if you work at it from one fixed point at a time, they might not all feel cohesive. It's the same principle as if you work on a large drawing and or on any size drawing and or design, and you know you start just doing all the details before you actually design your whole composition and work the full page. So you really need to make sure that you work the whole object before you actually start doing the kind of fun part, which is the detail work. Um, so notice that I'm doing that. This is going to be a sped up construction because otherwise the video would be way too long. Just kind of like pay attention as I'm working, that I'm making decisions as I go, which glues I'm using, which tools I'm using. These are miniature spring clamps, small spring clamps. I didn't require that you get them if you come across them. They're very inexpensive, but they are very useful objects. But you can substitute those for tape when you see me using those, if you have a similar situation that you need to do. And you'll also notice I'm doing this in several sittings. I'm not going to be making this whole object in one sitting. So So here it is. So you've been watching me assemble this thing for a few minutes now, and you've noticed that there were many times where it kind of stopped and then started again. And I was like pulling clamps off in different spots. And that was because I would work in about 5 minute increments, 5 to 15 minute increments. So I would get all of the elements together, clamp them all down, tape them to stabilize everything while the liquid glue solidified, and then let that set up for a couple hours, sometimes overnight, before I tried to put two components together. So that actually made it so I could make the object a little bit, give it a little more energy, because I wouldn't have been able to have so many kind of open moments or um, moments on elements on a diagonal with if I was trying to glue it all at once with all of the glue being liquid at one time. It also, I think, even though it was about 2 days of gluing in these 5 to 15 minute increments, um, it takes much less time to do it that way, but you have to leave those days open to do that, than it would if I actually sat down and tried to glue it all at once, because I would be fighting gravity. I'd be fighting this liquid trying to become a solid. I would be fighting, I would also just be fighting the parts kind of not being rigid enough to to stay together. Even if it was taped and clamped, it still doesn't quite work the same. So perhaps you've been building along the way, and perhaps you're not in this situation. But um, if you are just like waiting until the very last minute to put it all together, you are likely going to find yourself in that situation. The other issue is that you might not be clear-headed enough in that state because if you leave it to the last minute, you are fighting the clock and kind of trying to get it done frantically. So you're not able to make editing decisions as easily because you are just kind of like following your original plan. So you might kind of automatically add in extra components that you made that don't look quite right. You might also not think to try to work back into some of your elements so that they can feel more unified. I actually cut back into some of the more solid pieces to make them feel more unified or transition into the um, elements with more ornate cutting and organic edges. Um, and your craftsmanship will also suffer because things are falling apart and you're trying to like kind of keep putting them back together. So just I hope that you're able to give yourself enough time to really sit with the work and have that presence of mind, have that dialogue and play with the materials and make those smart choices as you're working versus leaving everything to the end. Because as I said before, all of that work that you put into the components doesn't really matter if you don't give as much attention to the final um, element, the final kind of component of all the parts coming together. So I look forward to seeing how you have um, used these processes and how you have used your source imagery for your own objects. And hopefully, this was helpful to kind of get you in the right planning state and headspace in order to get there.